Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kamavindi wash process Kenya from Hocus Pocus Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Hocus Pocus, based out of Pyeongtaek, South Korea. And this is part 2 of our 7-part series featuring the 7 Korean coffees from our most recent blind taste test rankings video. And if you watched that video, then you saw that this coffee finished 6th place out of those 7 coffees on that day. And I actually got this one mixed up with the John Small Kenyan coffee that we're also going to be reviewing in this series. But I was immediately able to tell that both of those coffees were the Kenyan coffees on that table. So in addition to seeing how this one finished by the end, it'll be interesting to see how those 2 Kenyan coffees compared to each other, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually the same as the felt recipe we went with, which is a slightly toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. Once again, there is one coffee in this series that we're reviewing that did feel a little bit more developed than this one as well, but this roaster in general did seem to be a little bit more on the developed side of things, and it's pretty similar on parts of that felt coffee as well, though this one had a slight bit less smokiness to it. Even then, I would say that the profiles are pretty similar in that they're closer to probably being that true medium, if maybe on the slightly lighter side of that medium, or even then you could say on the significantly more developed side of that medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression, and it was that blind taste test day. And of course, what gave this coffee away was that Kenyan-like brightness to it that definitely stood out relative to the other coffees on that table, with the exception, of course, of the other Kenyan that we're going to be featuring in this series. It did have a little bit more savoriness than the other Kenyan coffee on that table, and I couldn't necessarily tell which of the two it was going to be based off of that, given no familiarity with either of those 2 coffee roasters going into that video. Nonetheless, it resulted in being my second least favorite of those coffees, but that was our first impression as we move on to day 29, opting for the Chemex. And what was so interesting about this coffee was just how citric forward it was right from the onset, as the listed lime felt like the most pronounced attribute. And that took me a little bit by surprise, as I'm fully expecting this coffee to be pretty on par with what you would expect from a Kenyan coffee, perhaps a little bit more on the brighter side of things in terms of that tart berry aspect, but that certainly wasn't the case, as for whatever reason, the citric attributes of this one really seemed to dominate the majority of the experiences within this coffee. In addition to that, there was a slight bit of that classic Kenyan red berry, but notably less prominent than I was initially expecting. Day 32 through the April brewer, and the cup did have a notable bit of intensity to it, once again skewing in the citric aspects with a pretty lively and pronounced grapefruit bitterness as well. And that's something that we're going to be discussing a lot throughout this coffee, is the bitterness, as that continued to be one of the more defining factors of this one. Very Kenyan-like otherwise, with bright berries and an herbal florality, very much in line with the listed hibiscus descriptor. Day 35 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and there were some mixed results, as right off brew there's a little bit more of a focus on the candied aspects of the cup, and actually quite liked that. I'm not entirely sure what roasting machine they use for their coffees, but outside of that, I would say that there was a slight bit better clarity and definition to the red berry aspects, but the cool down itself lost a lot of the structure, with a continued focus on the citric bitterness and a very slight smoky quality to it as well. Day 38 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was by far the best that had been up to this point, as there was much more of the candied sweet aspects to the cup at this time. Brightness continues to remain the most prominent aspect, very much on the citric side of things nonetheless, as it's remained for the most part pretty consistent, at least in terms of that sense as well. Day 41 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was the most amount of smokiness I had experienced to the cup at this point, as it didn't necessarily feel like this coffee was aging particularly well. We'll need to go back to some of the previous adjustments, as this really seemed to dominate the majority of the coffee. Day 44 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was a fair bit better than some of the previous days. It was reminiscent of some of the earlier impressions, with the citric intensity and a little bit more bitter of a sense, as it continues to dominate the slightly more classic tart berry attributes of this one. Once again, a little bit of a curveball when it came to this coffee, but it makes a little bit of sense given that none of the descriptors they have of this coffee actually lend itself towards that classic red berry profile of Kenyan coffees. A slight sugary sweetness as well, but mostly the bitter citric qualities. Day 47, one more try through the Chemex with those lower extraction adjustments, and it did seem to emphasize a little bit of that bitter citric quality as well. That citric zest, some bitter lime, and the illicit grapefruit all felt very apt with a very notable bitterness to the cup. In addition to that, there was a slight bit more of that candied aspect once again, which seemed to come through a little bit more with this slight adjustment. So that's the overall experience we'd had up to that point. But let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Right, and a couple of level 4s. So we'll start with the finish, and I think we'll discuss it right alongside the acidity level 4. As I always say, it doesn't seem to matter who is roasting a Kenyan coffee. It's a massive surprise to me if the finish and the brightness don't score at that level 4 mark, as there's still plenty of that long-lasting, brighter, acidic attribute to this coffee. Much more in that citric sense and citric side of thing, as opposed to that very notable and defined tart berry-like component. But it is one of the most defining factors of this coffee, and it does leave a very long-lasting finish in that sense. So both those things certainly justified at that level 4. And we could have possibly discussed that alongside of the citrus fruit scoring at that level 4, as once again, it was so interesting to me that the descriptors they have of this coffee all seem to be slightly more bitter citric qualities to it. As when I tried the coffee for the first time, I said, why is it so much more citric forward as opposed to maybe a little bit more of those tart berry aspects? There was a little bit of savoriness to it as well, so I could have definitely seen an additional Kenyan characteristic. But for the most part, the entire time I was drinking this coffee, I'm like, this doesn't necessarily taste like the average experience I have with the Kenyan coffee. And that seemed to be pretty consistent throughout, as the citrus fruit is by far the most dominant attribute within this coffee. Then we have a lot of level 3s. So we will start with the sweetness level 3. I mentioned that there is a slight candied sweetness, but outside of that, I feel like this one was a little bit more true to the Kenyan-like characteristics, which at times they can be a little bit more on the sweeter side of things, but I feel like the vast majority of Kenyan coffees that I do end up reviewing score a little closer to that 3 mark, and this one was at no point ever going to come close to that level 4, as it had sweetness, a little bit of that candied sweetness, but for the most part, once again, it just continued to skew in that citric side of things. Berry fruit level 3, and it's always kind of surprising to me when the berry aspects of a Kenyan coffee doesn't score at that level 4 mark, and there's still tart berries to it, don't get me wrong. There's those currants, there's those just overall red tones to this one, but outside of that, I would say that it was nowhere near the overall kind of defining citric qualities that were present within it. So level 3 is where we decided to place it. Florality level 3, I mentioned briefly that there's a little bit of that herbal red tone to the cup as well, and that's definitely in line with the listed hibiscus that they had, but once again, that was still secondary to a very strong citric profile within this coffee. And then we will go to the caramel level 3, that's the candied sweetness I briefly mentioned. Bitterness level 3, and that's probably the most defining factor of this coffee, is right alongside of the citrus is a lot of bitterness within that citrus itself. So I think they have something along the lines of maybe a lime zest. I could have that wrong, but just in general, the overall, I think it's actually orange zest and lime, but the overall pretty intense bitterness to the citric tones within this coffee were very prominent throughout the entirety of it. Savoriness level 3, that's to say that this coffee was not void of that savory quality. I wouldn't say that it had maybe a true tomato-like characteristic to it, but a little bit more of those savory tart aspects within this coffee. Body level 3, just a little bit more of that medium-bodied experience within this one, and it's kind of interesting once again making this tasting wheel alongside a number of the other coffees in this series, but it was definitely a lot more in that sense. And then the final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel is the cleanliness level 3. And I feel like it's going to be kind of defined by a couple of things, the savoriness being as high as it is, and of course that slight smoky quality to it. Outside of that, while there is really nice definition to the citric qualities, I would say that the just strong and intense bitterness to it can also slightly hinder the overall cleanliness and clarity of this coffee. So that's the main reason for it finishing at that level 3. I'm not sure that's a great excuse, but I mean, none of the profiles within this coffee would I say are extraordinarily well defined outside of the just very strong bitter citric tones. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one's a little different for a Kenyan coffee in general, and I think a lot of people know that when it comes to Kenyan coffees, they're not necessarily my favorite if they're not going to offer the level of sweetness that's equal to the brightness overall. And that was certainly the case with this one. And at times I've grown accustomed to the very prominent red berry tones to it. But when it comes to much more bitter citrus, that's something that I'm definitely not overly interested in. And going into this one, I genuinely didn't know what to expect, but I did want to include a couple of Kenyan coffees because I was curious to see what some Korean coffee roasters would do with some Kenyan coffees. And it's nice to know that this is so much more different and unique than a lot of the Kenyan coffees that we've reviewed on this channel up to this point, even if it wasn't necessarily in the direction that I would enjoy for a coffee like this. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to? Well, we'll start with this. It does offer the Kenyan tones and characteristics that a lot of people look for. So that lingering, long-lasting red profile to the coffee. It still has those red berries. It still has that florality. But in addition to that, it's just skewing a little bit more on that citric side of things, which I've gone over a lot. But if you do like the more citric qualities of these Kenyan coffees, then I feel like this one's a really nice fit for you because the citric tones in it can be listed in a number of different ways. They listed it in a number of different ways. I experienced it in a number of different ways. At the end of the day, though, the citric qualities are just so strong and dominant that if those are tones and characteristics that you really enjoy and prefer within your Kenyan coffee, then this one's going to be a very nice fit for you in that sense. But I feel like that's also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kamavindi wash processed Kenya from Hocus Pocus Roasters. Thank you for watching.